"Get this woman out of here, now." The words cut through the wedding crowd like a blade. Every guest stepped back, every eye filled with judgment, while Jada stood alone, silent and unwelcome. No one knew her name, yet everyone had already decided who she was. But they had no idea what truth was about to unfold, or how this single moment would expose decades of buried injustice. Because when the groom finally spoke her name, everything changed. Are you ready to see why? Comment and tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories. Before that wedding day, Jada lived a life built on quiet strength. She wasn't someone who chased attention or sought recognition. Her world revolved around discipline, purpose, and a deep connection to the legacy her family carried through generations. Though many people only saw her calm presence, very few understood how much history lived behind her eyes. History tied to soil, memories, and a home her ancestors once built with their own hands. Jada had grown accustomed to moving through rooms where people made assumptions before ever learning her name. She never responded with anger. Instead, she carried herself with a dignity that made others pause. Yet beneath that quiet composure, she carried the weight of a past that had been taken from her family piece by piece, year by year, until almost no one remembered the truth anymore. As the wedding day approached, Jada knew she would be stepping into a place she had not seen in decades, a place once filled with the laughter of her father, the careful work of her grandfather, and the stories her great-grandfather passed down about building a life from nothing. But she also knew that returning there wouldn't be welcomed, not by the people who now claimed it as their own. Still, she wasn't coming for attention or conflict or recognition. She came because some truths cannot stay buried forever. And sometimes, standing silently in a room full of judgment speaks louder than any confrontation ever could. As she approached the estate that morning, she walked with a familiarity no one else noticed. Each path, each turn, each hidden detail etched into her memory. And though she expected resistance, she didn't expect the entire crowd to treat her presence like a threat. The tension in the air felt heavy, almost predictive, like the calm right before a storm no one sees coming, because on that day, every assumption made about Jada would be tested and shattered. From the moment Jada stepped onto the estate grounds, the shift in the atmosphere was immediate, subtle at first, then sharp enough to cut through her composure. Every conversation seemed to pause mid-sentence as she passed. Every pair of eyes carried the same unspoken judgment, the same disbelief that someone like her dared to stand among them. It wasn't the first time she had felt this kind of scrutiny, but the scale of it, an entire crowd moving in silent agreement, made the air unsettlingly heavy. The staff noticed her first. Their reactions were complicated. Recognition flickered across faces that quickly turned away as if afraid to show what they knew. Some bowed their heads respectfully, but not a single one dared say a word. Decades had passed, yet pieces of the truth still lived in the quiet corners of this place, hidden away beneath layers of wealth and reinvention. But the guests? Their response was immediate and merciless. Jada watched as people stepped aside sharply, forming invisible walls around her path. Expensive dresses rustled with impatience. Polished shoes dug into the grass to avoid standing too close. Their expressions revealed everything: suspicion, irritation, and an underlying fear, born not from danger, but from prejudice. And yet, Jada walked with the certainty of someone who had crossed these grounds long before any of them ever set foot here. The deeper she moved into the estate, the more the tension thickened. Guests whispered behind manicured hands. A few bold ones stared openly, scanning her from head to toe as if assessing whether she belonged, even for a moment, in their curated world. Every step she took pulled more attention, more resistance, more hostility. She approached familiar landmarks: the old oak tree with initials carved into its bark, the stone path her grandfather once repaired by hand, the reflecting pool where her father taught her the meaning of legacy. Each detail sharpened her memory, grounding her while the crowd's reactions worked to unsteady her. Hours of judgment compressed into minutes. Then came the shift. What began as quiet whispers transformed into visible discomfort, then into collective agitation, as if her very presence unsettled the estate's fabricated history. Staff who recognized her grew anxious, torn between truth and the consequences of acknowledging it. Guests grew louder, feeding off each other's ignorance. Faces tightened, postures stiffened. People gathered in clusters, creating a circle of hostility that followed her around the reception space. Their assumptions escalated rapidly, their suspicions sharpened, their narrative formed without a single fact. Jada noticed everything. She saw which guest avoided her gaze entirely. She saw who looked at her with disgust, who watched with curiosity, and who whispered with exaggerated confidence, crafting stories about her presence. Some believed she was lost. Others believed she was trespassing. A few looked at her as if waiting for a reason to feel threatened. Yet the most striking reactions were from those who recognized her but were too afraid to show it. Those who had lived on this land for years, knowing they were walking through someone else's legacy. The rising tension finally reached its breaking point when attention shifted not just to her, but to the ripple effect she caused. Every step she took exposed cracks in the carefully curated facade around her. The estate felt less like a place of celebration and more like a stage where truth and pretense collided. By the time she reached the far side of the property, the weight of every stare, every whisper, every unspoken accusation pressed on her like a storm waiting to break. And without saying a word, Jada realized something important. The crowd wasn't reacting to a stranger. They were reacting to a reality they weren't prepared to face. Because the deeper she walked into the estate, the closer she came to the truth none of them wanted revealed. The tension that had been simmering all afternoon finally erupted when the guests shifted from silent judgment to open hostility. What had begun as whispers had grown into a loud collective certainty, each person convinced they understood who Jada was without ever learning her story. The crowd formed a tightening circle around her, fueled not by truth, but by fear disguised as confidence. Their eyes hardened, their assumptions sharpened, and suddenly the estate felt less like a place of celebration and more like a courtroom without justice. Jada felt the weight of generations in that moment, her family's history being erased right in front of her, replaced by a narrative crafted by those who never cared to know the truth. She could feel the sting of inherited prejudice, the kind that didn't need words to wound. Every stare said the same thing: she did not belong here. And yet, she belonged more than anyone present. The tension reached its peak when the groom arrived, drawn by the chaos. The crowd, emboldened by their shared delusion, treated Jada as if she were an intruder threatening their comfort. Their movements grew sharper, accusations forming in their expressions even without a single word spoken. Some guests stepped forward as if prepared to force her out themselves. Others watched from a distance, relieved someone else would do what they believed needed to be done. The staff, who had recognized her from the start, stood frozen, fearful of consequences, uncertain of how much truth they were allowed to acknowledge. A few had tears in their eyes, torn between loyalty to their employers and respect for the woman whose legacy built the very ground beneath their feet. And in the middle of that turmoil, the groom stopped cold. His entire expression changed. The truth struck him in an instant. Recognition washed over him, followed by disbelief, guilt, and something far deeper. Jada stood completely still, her dignity unshaken. She had been targeted, judged, and pushed to the very edge of humiliation. She had endured the full force of a crowd that united in prejudice, a crowd that believed its status gave it the authority to decide who mattered. But now, everything held its breath. The energy shifted. The groom's realization sent a ripple through the crowd. Their confidence faltered, their certainty cracked. Faces that had been sharpened with contempt now softened with confusion. The foundation of their assumptions trembled beneath the weight of what was coming. Because the truth was no longer avoidable. The moment Jada had been pushed into this breaking point was the same moment the people around her were about to learn something that would dismantle every judgment they had thrown at her. A single truth was about to change everything. And the question hung in the air like a storm about to break. What happens when the person they tried to push out is the one person who had every right to be there? When the truth finally settled over the crowd, the silence on the estate felt heavier than all the accusations they had thrown at Jada. The groom's recognition shifted the entire atmosphere, exposing the fragile foundation beneath every judgment made that day. Suddenly, the people who had stared at her with certainty now found themselves staring at the ground, unable to meet the eyes of the woman they had condemned without reason. Jada didn't need to raise her voice or defend herself. Her presence, her composure, and her undeniable connection to the history of that land spoke louder than any explanation ever could. The staff who had once whispered in fear now stepped forward with quiet respect, relieved that the truth they had carried in silence had finally come to light. A legacy that had been buried under years of rewriting and entitlement was no longer hidden, but the impact ran deeper than the shock of the moment. For many guests, the experience became a mirror, reflecting the biases they never questioned, the assumptions they made without hesitation, and the ease with which they dismissed someone based solely on skin color. The estate's wealth, elegance, and tradition suddenly looked different when contrasted with the reality of how quickly injustice took root there. As Jada walked away from the gathering, she didn't carry revenge or bitterness. She carried clarity. She understood that the hurt she endured was part of a much larger pattern, one that stretched far beyond those gates. Her family's story wasn't just history, it was a reminder of how easily power can be twisted, erased, or stolen when society refuses to see the humanity behind a name. And as viewers, we're left with a simple, difficult question. When the truth stands right in front of us, do we recognize it, or do we only see what we've been taught to believe? If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And make sure you subscribe to Black Community Struggles for more powerful stories about justice, truth, and our community's fight to be seen.